All right. Hello and welcome to our new webinar series, Carbon Insetting versus Carbon Offsetting. My name is Oliver. I'm your host today. I'm the founder of gryn. And I have exciting guests with me here on the session. First of all, Talia, Head of Sustainability at gryn. And we have also Niklas Witte with us. And Niklas has a lot of experience in the topic of sustainable fuels. He used to work with Hamburg Süd and Maersk in the sustainability department, and recently founded his own company, Never Mind the Gap, to help companies on their path to zero emissions. Yeah, welcome, Talia and Niklas. I'm excited about the topic because over the next few years, the relevance of, let's say, sustainable fuels will year by year significantly increase because companies will realize achieving their annual reduction targets is more challenging than they guess. And the use of sustainable fuels, meaning insetting, is one, let's say, mechanism to complement the portfolio of, let's say, initiatives to, let's say, reduce your carbon emissions. Yeah, then welcome. Let's start.
Yeah, all right. Thank you, Oliver, for the introduction. Yeah, first of all, let's have a look on the agenda so that you know what we will be talking about today. So yeah, the topic is carbon credits and yeah, in general, differences between insetting and offsetting. And the idea actually for this webinar came up when a couple of weeks ago, the SBTi, or more precisely the Board of Trustees, they announced that they are currently evaluating the use of certain kind of carbon credits for reducing company scope 3 emissions. And this created a lot of confusion in the sustainability world, let's say. And that's why I would like to start with a short explanation of carbon credits, the differences between offsetting and insetting, and also the current and potential future handling of carbon credits for achieving science-based reduction targets based on the SBTi's view. And then we will come to the regulatory part, where we'll explain what's defined by the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the CSRD, through the reporting standard for climate change, the ESA SE1, regarding the use of carbon credits. And afterwards, I will give you an example of actually quite flexible insetting activity that can usually be counted towards emission reduction targets. And then lastly, Niklas will give us some market insights and best practices from his experience as sustainability manager at Maersk, but also, of course, as now a leading consultant and founder of Never Mind the Gap. All right, so yeah, let's dive into the topic. So first of all, we should start off with a short explanation of carbon credits, focusing on the voluntary carbon market. And I'm pretty sure most of you already know about the existence and purpose of carbon credits. So carbon credits are tradable certificates that represent an avoidance or removal of 1 ton CO2 from the atmosphere. So, and there are generally 2 types of carbon credits. So we have the avoidance credits, which means that a carbon emitting activity is prevented from happening. For example, the avoidance of deforestation or fuel switches to low carbon sources. And then we have also removal carbon credits, which cover carbon removal processes such as direct air capture or also forestation measures. And so companies, they use carbon credits to neutralize their emissions by investing in these avoidance or removal credits. And initially, a few years ago, actually a lot of hope was placed into carbon credits, as there was a lack of climate finance and companies were simply, of course, and still struggling with reaching net zero. And thus, carbon credits seemed as a useful tool to kickstart climate finance and the innovation of clean technologies. However, then last year, you also might have heard about that, everything kind of took a turn in 2023 because there a study found out that mainly nature-based projects, such as forestry projects, which were even certified by a leading carbon standard, did not really represent real emission reductions. And especially forestry programs significantly overestimated their prevention of deforestation. And this then eventually led to a price slump throughout the entire year of 2023 of all carbon credits, so across all categories. And because major corporate buyers, they simply stepped back from purchasing these carbon credits because they were, of course, afraid of being accused of climate or greenwashing. And now through this, let's call it incident, the challenges on both the supply and the demand side of the voluntary carbon market became visible and must be addressed. And this is already in process. So first, on the supply side, it must be ensured that carbon credits represent real, additional, and permanent reduction. And this actually requires an alignment of standards, methodologies across different organizations that certify projects and credits. And as said, this is actually already in progress, as many organizations such as the CDP and the target setting bodies such as SBTi, they are already putting a lot of effort to simply streamline the definition of a high quality carbon credit. And they're also working on how carbon credit should be applied to offsetting efforts. And then secondly, on the demand side, companies should make sure that they are purchasing high quality carbon credits, and that they also should use carbon credits only as a supplement to their overarching decarbonization strategy. But about this, we will also talk later when I will explain a little bit more the use of carbon credits for emission abatement to reach climate targets. So let's now have a look on the differences between offsetting and insetting, using the logistics sector as an example. So as mentioned before, when talking about carbon credits, there's a climate investment gap, also in the logistics sector. And on the carrier side, the challenge is mainly the high cost for the transition to low carbon technologies, because it involves, of course, buying new assets, so new vessels, new truck fleets, etc. And it is nearly impossible for carriers to remain competitive when voluntarily renewing fleets or switching to low carbon fuels. And then on the shipper side, the challenge is the lack of control of their Scope 3 emissions, as transports are because transports and supply chains are very complex, and they are often handled through freight forwarders. They often, like shippers, often do not know which vessels have been used or which fuels, etc. So there's really lack of knowledge. Now a shipper could decide to offset the company's emissions through the usage of carbon credits, like you can see here on the left side. So offsetting is a compensation for climate impacts by funding mitigation projects outside the sector of impact and value chain. So the invested money actually leaves the sector to fund carbon reduction or removal projects outside the sector where the emissions originated and outside the shipper's value chain. And that's why carbon insetting might be a financially more sustainable option, because it has the potential to decarbonize the logistics sector and supply chain. So a shipper who wants to reduce his supply chain logistics emission could instead or additionally invest in decarbonization measures within the sector where the emissions originated. So shippers could engage with their suppliers and invest in fleet renewals, sustainable fuels, or engine retrofits, and eventually claim the resulting actual emission reduction for their corporate carbon footprint. And for sure, insetting projects, they they require lots of collaboration, sometimes with the suppliers. They take more time, but on the mid and long term, the investment most likely will pay off. And later in this webinar, I will give you also a quick example of a relatively immediate and flexible insetting option, as mentioned already in the introduction. Yeah, so now that you have the basic knowledge of carbon credits and insetting and offsetting, we will talk about the usage of for them for reaching science-based emission reduction targets. So science-based target can be set by using the approach of the Science-Based Targets Initiative, the SBTI. Yeah, which is the most popular organization for this purpose. And the key elements of the SBTI approach is that yeah, you can see basically in this graph here. So the SBTI actually requires companies who want to set science-based targets to follow this 1.5 degrees aligned emission pathway. And to be able to do so, a company must set near-term targets and long-term targets. So the near-term target here you can see this is the sector agnostic default targets minus 42% of scope 1 and 2 emissions until 2030, and for scope 3 minus 25%. And then companies also must set the long-term target, which is minus 90%. Until 2050, and the rest or the residual 10% must be fully neutralized by the permanent removal or storage of the emissions. However, what you can see here, it's the three. Offsetting or like the emission reduction must come from real abatement and reduction measurements within the operational control and supply chain, and offsettings are not allowed. This is the three, and it's called beyond value chain mitigation by the SBTI. So carbon offsets are not allowed for emission abatement purposes. They are only additional, and they are even recommended by the SBTI, but yeah, you can't count them towards your emission reduction goal. So yeah, while carbon offsetting does not count towards emission reduction, carbon insetting projects, they are individually evaluated, as there are no recognized carbon inset standard accounting standard yet. And yeah, Niklas, could you maybe explain a little bit more what that means and what kind of maybe insetting project can be counted for emission reduction?
So Talia, I think this is probably the question I heard most frequently over the last 5 years, right? Mm-hmm. Is this insetting initiative eligible for SBTI reductions? And like you said, the short answer is maybe, right? So an insetting project may be allowed under SBTI if it meets certain criteria or guardrails, as they call them. And these ifs are if it uses a correct accounting approach, if it is contained within acceptable value chain boundaries, and if it's linked directly to your sourcing. So that's a lot of ifs, and that's why the short answer is maybe. But to give you a little bit more context, and just take 1 minute on that. So in the latest guidance from the SBTI, which is the SBTI corporate net zero standard that was issued in March this year, the SBTI makes it clear again that, as you said, there is no standardized definition of the term insetting. And that makes it very difficult to give a clear answer as to whether an initiative is acceptable or not for scope 3 reduction, right? So insetting today is such a broad term that it could theoretically apply to a mitigation project contained within this value chain of your own company, but it could also be a project that partially sits in another company's supply chain. And that's where the complexity arises. And then there are also different accounting methods and approaches present for different insetting solutions, right? Some use project accounting, some use inventory accounting, and that also complicates a little bit further. So to kind of sum it up, there is further work ongoing by the SBTI and also the Greenhouse Gas Protocol to standardize a definition of insetting. And once that's done, there will be a lot more clarity. But until then, the SBTI really says, insetting initiatives can be used on a case-by-case basis, but they recommend what they call a conservative approach. So you should only include emissions reductions from insetting projects that use the corporate inventory accounting method that are wholly contained within your own supply chain and are linked directly to sourcing. Then you're good to go, right? So it's a complex topic. We could probably do a webinar just on that topic. Maybe that's a follow-up for the future.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks a lot for the clarification, Niklas. And yeah, now mentioned in the introduction, the idea for this webinar came up when a couple of weeks ago, the SBTi's Board of Trustees and the technical advisory group had a debate around the use of carbon credits for abatement purposes. So I don't know, you might have heard about it as well. So the Board of Trustees has like the overall responsibility of for the governance of the SBTi, and they have published a statement in which they stated that they are currently reviewing the net zero standard and that they might allow so-called environmental attribute certificates for the abatement purposes of Scope 3 emissions, which you can read here. So environmental attribute certificates, they quantify, verify, and track the environmental benefits that are associated with climate mitigation activities or projects. So for example, emission reduction credits, energy attribute certificates for renewable energy. Then there are also sustainable aviation fuel certificates. And all of these are called environmental attribute certificates. And then there was a lot of criticism that came from the technical advisory group because, the technical advisory group, they are a technical decision-making body, and they are usually reviewing and approving SBTi standards. And the Board of Trustees, they have published this statement without any approval of the technical advisory group. And that's why the Board of Trustees was highly criticized for that, for kind of publishing a statement like that without even notifying the technical advisory group. And there was also, of course, a lot of confusion among the clients and followers of the SBTi. And so the technical advisory group, they really had to make clear that the net zero standard has not been changed yet. And that is also something that we want to highlight here, that no changes have been made yet. There will be a first try of this assessment of the use of these certificates. And this assessment or the first results will be published next month in July 2024. And then we will know more about the entire evaluation. However, some insights have already been shared about this topic. So the SBTi made clear that they will stick to their principles, that they will define specific guard rate and thresholds in case like environmental attribute certificates will be allowed. And most importantly, they highlighted that this current investigation does not include neutralization targets or beyond value chain mitigation. So, for example, removal credits won't be part of this potential change. And this means that the current ongoing evaluation most likely will probably cover like this insetting topic that we were just talking about, as there's like a lack of clarification, definition, etc. So usually, and as we are talking about this environmental attribute certificates, it can be assumed that this is mainly about so-called insetting initiatives. Now let's have a look on the regulatory view of carbon credits. So, and what must be considered for the use of carbon credits in context with the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And for those of you who are not familiar with the CSRD yet, so the CSRD entered into force last year, and it requires more and more companies to report on sustainability topics in the coming years. And together with the CSRD, 10 topical standards were published, which are the guidance for how companies must report on certain sustainability topics. And there is the topic climate change, which is covered by the ESA SE1. And the ESA SE1 requires companies to not only report on emissions, but also to define a full decarbonization strategy. And this, of course, includes as a starting point a greenhouse gas inventory of own operation and the entire value chain. And yeah, companies must follow the principles of the greenhouse gas protocol. And furthermore, companies are required to set and track science-based targets, for example, according to the reduction pathways of the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which we have just discussed. And yeah, eventually also reduction roadmaps must be defined, but companies have to state how they want to achieve those reductions. So for example, a 10% reduction by through the switch from fossil fuels to renewable, or from fossil to renewable energy, for example. And now, of course, the question is, can carbon credits be used for achieving ESA SE1 reduction targets? And as expected, also here, it really depends on the type of carbon credit. And so, for example, in paragraph 32b, the ESRS says that the undertaking shall not include greenhouse gas removal, carbon credits, or avoided emissions as a means of achieving the greenhouse gas emission reduction target. And then later they say carbon credits issued from greenhouse gas emission reduction project within a company's value chain shall be included in greenhouse gas inventory. So for scope 2 and 3. And yeah, this means basically that here again, carbon offset credit cannot be included for the achievement of a reduction target. And however, they must be reported separately. Whereas carbon credits from emission reduction within a company's value chain, which means carbon insetting credits, they must be included in the greenhouse gas inventory itself and therefore count directly as an emission reduction. So last but not least, I would like to talk an insetting activity called book and claim. Which can be kind of used in a quite flexible way. You probably have heard about book and claim, as there are already many book and claim offerings in the market. And book and claim is a so-called chain of custody system. And a chain of custody is the process of following materials such as sustainable fuels, for example, through every step of the supply chain. And this is done through a series of procedures, technologies, documents, to track materials from source to the end product. And a book of claim, just chain of custody model, simply allows the physical mixing of products with certain characteristics with other products along a supply chain. So for example, the mixing of sustainable fuels with conventional fuels. And as you can see here in this image, we have a conventional fuel provider and a low emission fuel provider, and both fuels are being mixed at a certain point in the supply chain. And the characteristics of the low emission fuel, however, is tracked separately from the physical flow of the fuel. And these characteristics are tracked through so-called emission profiles. And an emission profile, for example, consists of, for example, the energy content, the mass or volume of the fuel, the greenhouse gas emission factor, feedstocks, production processes, etc. And these emission profiles are being booked when a solution provider catalogs them in an emission, the emission profile in a tracking system, which you can see here. And this emission profile can then be claimed from the tracking system by a carrier or by a shipper who are willing to pay extra for low emission solutions. But this also means that the carrier and the shipper that they might not physically receive any low emission fuel, so that the carrier does not physically receive any low emission fuel, and that the shipper's freight is not physically transported on a vessel using low emission fuels. And there are also other custody concepts, as you can see here, such as the mass balance or the physical separation custody concept. But unfortunately, we don't have the time to cover these two concepts here in this session. But because of the separation of the physical product and the emission profile, book and claim kind of gives gives a lot of flexibility for shippers and carriers to claim low emission profiles for their emission reduction strategies. So a shipper can report the greenhouse gas emission profile of a low emission solution, and a carrier or solution provider, they can assign the emissions profile of a low emission fuel to the organization that is willing to pay extra cost for it. And all that is possible even though the freight is not physically transported on a low emission transportation asset. And so this flexibility kind of makes the decarbonization of the transport sector easier, as low emission solutions are easier to access through book and claim compared to other custody systems. And last but not least, there are also, as also mentioned in the context of carbon credits in the beginning, and there are also certain criteria that must be fulfilled to successfully book and claim a low emission solution. So, for example, there is the so-called additionality of the insetting project, which is a really important aspect. So additionality means that the emission reduction would not have occurred or would have happened without the insetting project. The Smart Freight Center, they define it as a criterion whether a solution is required by regulation, which is a slightly different definition. So, for example, in this definition, if a regulation requires a fuel supplier to include 2% of low emission fuel in all fuel provided in a certain region, for example, then the volumes of the low emission fuel with up to 2% blend mandate are not additional. Everything above 2% would be a bit additional, but everything below wouldn't be additional. So then we have the criteria, another criteria is that emissions and reduction must be quantified, monitored, and reported and verified by a third party to simply ensure accuracy and also reliability. And then furthermore, double counting must be avoided. So double counting occurs when when two or more companies or organizations taking ownership of the same greenhouse gas emissions or emission profiles. So, and this can be avoided through the tracking and retirement of purchased certificates to ensure that the reduction is only being claimed once. However, not all double counting is, let's say, non-conforming. So, Niklas, could you maybe explain also from your experience why double counting often automatically occur and why that's actually not a problem?
Yeah, so if you're a shipper, double counting is probably one of the biggest reputational risks that you could have if you're using an insetting solution, right? So this was something that held back some early products in the insetting space. So basically, what you have is the fact that emission reductions, they are achieved once, but then being reported twice by two separate companies. Okay, and that's not a theoretical concern. There were real instances of this happening in the past. And it usually occurs at the time when the emission reductions are generated in scope 1, so at carrier level, for example, and they're then transferred to other companies, scope 3 emissions, so usually a shipper, right? Now, theoretically, there's a risk here that these savings or reductions could be transferred to several parties at the same time. So there was like a gap in the process. And this could be accidental or intentional mistakes, of course. But to overcome this, book and claim, as Talia said, set up this solid chain of custody, right? So like chronological documentation that records the sequence of custody and transfers, okay? So by booking, when you generate an emission savings, all these transactions in the register, the book and claim registry, which is independently audited and therefore ensures traceability, you're being able to mitigate this risk. So in layman terms, this ultimately, if you're a shipper, gives you the insurance that the emission reduction credits that you claim and purchase can only be claimed by you and by no one else. So no double counting can occur under book and claim. So the risk of any reputational damage to you is absolutely reduced.
Okay, perfect. Thanks a lot. I think that made the point clear what double counting actually is. So, and then there's still another some criteria. So there's the vintage requirement, and the vintage requirement, it refers to the year in which a low emission fuel or solution was generated. So there's like the requirement that low emission solution usually must be booked within 12 months of generation, and that they must be included in the emission inventory of the shipper, for example, that claims at latest 24 months after the low emission fuel was being booked. And then, as we're talking about sustainable fuels, of course, they must be also compliant with certain sustainability criteria, for example, with the Renewable Energy Directive 2. And then, of course, also an important part is the mission profiles themselves and their transference status and everything must be properly tracked in registries. So these were like the main criteria. And now I would say I would like to hand over to Niklas. He will give you some market insights, best practices based on his experience, and maybe also address already some questions that came up.
Actually, Talia, let me maybe start with a question, because there's a good one in the chat. And I want to take it first. So the question here, in case you haven't read it, is can you give an example of a carbon insetting project which was applicable or accepted under SBTI? That's a very good question. And I'm not the SBTI, right? And the fact it's assessed on a case-by-case basis means cases can be decided different, even if there was a historic precedent. But a very, very simple example to illustrate is this problem of the value chain boundaries, right? So the SBTI wants you to mitigate your emissions within your own value chain. So the moment that you start implementing projects that are not linked directly to your sourcing and your value chain, you have a problem. And one, we've been talking a lot about shipping now, but let's maybe take an example from trucking, because that's a little bit easier to to explain, right? Let's say you have operations in Germany, and in your supply chain, you use trucking logistics in Germany, right? Now, you may have a provider who does the trucking work for you. They transport stuff from, I don't know, Hamburg to Munich, let's say, for the sake of example. So that's your value chain. You are using trucking logistic activities from Hamburg to Munich. If this company offers you an insetting project, which generates the emissions reductions on trucks from Hamburg to Munich, this could be acceptable under SBTI. Doesn't mean that your product needs to be on these trucks, but it's the same value chain that you're using. It's a truck, right? That's what you use, and it's running from Hamburg to Munich. If, however, the same company also does trucking activities in the US, for example, and they also generate savings, emission savings on trucks in the US, then you would not be able to use these emission savings for your business, because this is not your supply chain. Even though it's also a truck and it's also the same supplier, it's not strictly your supply chain, because these trucks who generated the savings run in the US. Okay, so that is a very complex topic. There's a lot of ifs and buts, but maybe that's an easy way to look at it. So think about what your value chain is, where your operations are, what you're doing, and if the savings that generated are related to these, for example, in geographical sense, then that could be one criteria where the SBTI says, thumbs up, let's go. Okay, I hope that answers that one. If not, type us a message and we'll come back to it. So a short section of my experiences, right? Oliver tastes this a little bit. So I've spent the last 3 years working for Hamburg Süd and for Maersk, where I, on the one hand, developed and scaled and implemented sustainable solutions for logistics, for ocean, for trucking, for air freight, for rail. But I also advised shippers on how to decarbonize supply chains, right? And one question that I heard almost every single day from two different perspectives is, what should we offer and what should we buy? So from the perspective of a carrier, is what should we actually offer to shippers? You know, should we offer insetting? Should we offer offsetting? If we do insetting, should it be direct insets, mass balance, book and claim? What's the different value and what do customers want, right? And then from the shipper perspective, the questions that I always got are very simple. It's always, what should we buy and why, right? What's valuable to us? What reduces our risks? So I thought I'd give you some reflections on this and maybe some food for thought. And the way I would always start with this is, if you are considering to purchase an insetting solutions, you need to ask yourself first what your individual drivers are, right? So what are your motivations for wanting to reduce emissions? Because if you answer this question, ultimately it already determines what solution is most suitable for your company, right? And I would bet if you ask yourself that question, your answer will fit into one of 5 categories, right? You either want to reduce your emissions because you have an emissions reduction target, right? That could be internal, external, SBTI. So it's a governance driver. Or second bucket, you may be selling a product with environmental attributes that also needs sustainable logistics to be credible, right? So you have a revenue driver. The third case is probably you're getting pressure from investors, from customers, employees, regulators to be more sustainable, okay? Climate change is a very tangible topic to talk about. So this is a reputation driver. Maybe you simply want to start taking actions because you believe it's the right thing. So you could have an intrinsic motivation, right? Or the last scenario that I've witnessed, you may be very, very forward-looking and you already see the potential cost reduction of green logistics versus fossil fuels on the horizon as a result of taxation, for example, okay? So you're acting upon a cost driver. Now, whatever it may be, answer this first question to yourself: why am I doing it? And then see if it's governance related, revenue, cost, reputation, or if it's an intrinsic motivation. And then you look at question 2. So the question 2 is always, what attribute of this decarbonization solution that you're looking at is most important to you, right? And here you typically get 3 ideologies. Either you're going to tell me you want the lowest cost, or you're going to tell me I want the most credible and the most effective solution, or you're going to say I want something simple, something easy to understand, easy to communicate, and easy to implement, right? And your answer will probably typically depend on your role in the company. So my experience is, if you're in procurement, we're talking about costs. If you're in sustainability, we might be talking credibility and effect. And if you're in sales, you want something simple that you can sell on, right? So the question is, which opinion matters most in your company, right? And if you look at it from a high level, you have this trade-off triangle: cost, credibility, and ease. And those are the 3 factors that you consider when you look into which solution you want to choose. And let me tell you, you can't get all 3, right? So if you want something that's cheap and simple, you might be looking at an offset, okay? If you want something that is simple and credible, maybe book and claim is the way to go for you. And if you say, hey, credibility is the most important things to me, then a direct inset might be the way to go. The combination that doesn't exist yet is low cost and high credibility, right? That's the holy grail. And believe me, carriers, LSPs, and everyone is working towards it. But here's what I've reserved in reality, right? So when I started working on sustainable logistics, shippers went through an evolution. They started with offsets, right? I want to do something, I'm going to start with an offset. As they became a bit more experienced and more mature, they moved on to mass balance and book and claim solution. And some even explored things like direct insets, so my cargo on a green asset. And that hierarchy is, of course, a result of availability and cost, right? So you went for offsets in the beginning because it was available and it was cheap. Now, these days, 3 years down the line, most shippers do it exactly the other way around. So they start with exploring solutions for direct insets first, so my cargo on a green asset. If that doesn't work, they choose a mass balance or a book and claim solution. And offsetting has really become the last resort. Now the question is, why is that, right? What has changed? And it's simply down to the experiences that these companies made with offsets. So if you haven't done anything yet, this may be quite valuable to you, right? Because others have gone through this process and there's a reason why they've changed. So people simply made bad experiences with offsetting, right? So for once, there is things like SBTI guidance now saying, yes, it's not accepted, maybe in the future, whatever. But the fact is, in the past, there were issues with reputational damage, right? Talia already alluded to this. There was a big outcry last year. There were also problems with reversibility, right? So this is one example I always love. Remember the forest fires in Europe in the last few years? Now, some of those were offsetting projects. So trees planted specifically to offset company emissions, and now they're burned down. So what does that mean? Do you need to take the emissions reductions out of your balance sheet again? Do you have to replant the trees? Do you have to pay twice? It simply just highlights some of these issues with offsetting. And lastly, people stepped away from it because of a lack of acceptance by end customers, right? So say you're selling a green product and you're offsetting emissions for logistics, it's simply not believable anymore, right? People want to see real action. So there's a very clear trend now towards more credible solutions, which have an effect either directly at the source or at least in your same value chain, right? And insetting solutions are a very good option to achieve that. Okay, so I think I'm going to pause here because of time. We might have some more questions, right? But to sum it all up, offsets are no longer the first choice in the market for anyone who takes decarbonization seriously, right? The credibility of your solution is what trumps cost in the long run. And it's the last point. I think this is very important. This is still a differentiator towards your end customers, your employees, and maybe other stakeholders. So taking real action on real emissions reductions in your own value chain still sets you apart from your competition. All right. Shall we use the remaining time for some Q&A?
Perfect. Yeah, let's do that. So
with an example here from Mark. Talia, shall I start with that one?
yeah, sure.
So this goes back to my previous question. So if we have cross-European operations, how does your previous example apply, Nicholas? So Mark, that makes it simpler for you because your value chain is larger and therefore you have more space to argue against the SBTi that an insetting is within your value chain, right? So effectively it reduces the complexity of arguing, yes, this is my value chain. So as long as it still meets the other criteria, as in it's still directly linked to your sourcing, as in it uses inventory and counting approach, you're very likely that it will get accepted. Okay, but there are specifics between the different modes of transports. So for example, trucking has more geographic restrictions than ocean carriers, for example, or air freight. So one easy way to describe it, make sure the geography where the credits are generated are very close to your own, and also the companies who provide the service. So if the company who creates the emissions reduction and books it in book and claim is the same one that you use for your logistics, that also makes it easier against SBTi, right? But yeah, it's a complex question. If you have specific examples, Mark, I'm happy to follow up on this afterwards.
Perfect. Okay. Then another question was, I think we haven't answered it yet. Can you describe some example of tracking system? So does this tracking system is mandatory to valorize the emission reduction under SBTi? And yeah, I mean, tracking systems are there like to track like the characteristics of a low emission solution, and they are mandatory for SBTi. So you really have to track characteristics and the entire product. But I think as Niklas mentioned, maybe you can add a little bit more to it. It's not the only criteria for the SBTi that there's the tracking system. So there also are like these value chain reasons, and that they must be inside the entire, like the own value chain, that like the geographical and the mode of transport restriction, etc. So it's not only the tracking system that makes it like mandatory by the SBTi. Maybe Niklas, you can add some more content about that.
I think the problem here is it's a moving target, right? So this discussion evolves almost every week. So it's very difficult to comment on it. But what I would say in general is people worry a lot about the SBTi guidance, even if they don't have SBTi targets. So SBTi is, yes, it's the gold standard, and many people are aspiring to it. But before you worry too much about SBTi, just ask yourself the question if your company actually has an SBTi target, or if you want to have one in the future, because it's still only a fraction of the companies in the whole world that work towards SBTi, right? you can still use other non-SBTI compliant insetting projects to reduce your emissions under the greenhouse gas protocol. It's just that the SBTI is very, very specific in what they will allow. And again, it changes almost on a weekly basis. Yeah. So yes, it's important to look that way. And if you're really, really serious about it and you want to work towards a gold standard, by all means, work towards SBTI. But there's a whole range of things you can still do outside the SBTI framework that is still credible, still a real reduction. It doesn't count as an SBTI reduction in that sense. Maybe that helps at this point a little bit.
Okay, and I think we have two more questions. So, have you heard of examples where the use of the term carbon insetting is used for companies to develop in-house carbon reduction project using internal carbon taxes rates to fund a reduction pot? And I would hand over this question again to you, Niklas.
Not in this context, I have to say. No, really not. I mean, obviously, there's concept like shadow carbon taxes inside companies that might be more applicable to the scenario. But no, I haven't come across any specific projects where company use this carbon insetting approach for their own internal in-house carbon reduction projects. Because usually this is then a scope 1 and 2 activity you're talking about if it's in-house. So insetting doesn't come really into play at that stage. Talia, there's another question here at the end. From a communications perspective, the insetting process seems pretty complex. Yes. To explain to customers in your sustainability narrative. Do you have any experience of what has worked in the past? Some good practices. Let me think about this for 1 second. Talia, do you have an opinion on this? Whilst I just
Oh, I think I'm kind of missing the experience like to work with customers as I'm working in a software company. So unfortunately, I don't have any recommendation in that sense.
Okay, so what I can tell you is yes, it's definitely complex, right? And this is what I was partly alluding to when I was saying this, cost, credibility, and ease. Insetting is not simple to communicate. It's not simple if you want to sell it. And frankly, your end customers, whether they care about what you use is always a question, right? What has worked pretty well is visualizing this rather than writing it down or talking about it. If you look up, maybe we can share the link afterwards. There's some great examples and even videos on the internet, which visualizes quite well how insetting works, right? What some of the pitfalls are, what some of the challenges are. I think that's one tip I have if you want to communicate this to externally, internally. Visualization and short videos are very much better than if you get your sales folks to explain it, for example.
I have another point in terms of communication. The CSRD, meaning the ESRS, is basically also requiring the measurement of the fuel share, So that means this is a great thing to communicate. So if you basically drive up, the share of sustainable fuels, in your organization, then you can communicate that, that you say overall, we're using already 20% of sustainable fuel or 30%, So those achievements can be nicely communicated to the outside world. And this is actually also what the auditing firm, as part of the CSRD, is auditing and, let's say, approving at the end.
Okay. I think those were all the questions I've seen, unless I've missed one.
Yeah, good questions this time. Really active community. So I'm really amazed about the input. It was a lot of fun, the session with you guys today. And again, if you have questions afterwards, Talia, just show the next slide, their email addresses. So you can reach out to us. But in any case, and as always, you get the content by email, the entire video. You can share it, rewatch it, and reach out to us. Thanks a lot. Enjoy the day, and let's cross our fingers for the game tonight. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye. Ciao.